Hi everyone, welcome to Inside a Black Girl's Mind. I'm Eunice and this is
BiBi. Hey everybody.
Hope you're doing well. Today we will be discussing black horror with a review of two black horror movies that we've watched, His House and Bad Hair. Just a quick synopsis on His House. His House is a Black British made film. It is about a South Sudanese couple who have escaped a civil war in their country and seek asylum in the UK and are given this house. They're given a lot of regulations that come with having this house. They're not allowed to leave. They're not allowed to work. They're given £73 a month to live on. And as they're living in this house, we see that the house is haunted, and it becomes a real issue for them as they really want to stay, but it's like the couple have this tension of, oh, what's the point of staying in this house if it's haunted? And then we just see like the unraveling of that story.
Right. And it's a pretty crazy story, honestly.
Yeah.
Like, it's not something that we really consider. Like, I've never thought about what it would be like to be an asylum seeker and to have to live within those constraints. So
Same. It's really interesting, like, just to see like the dynamic of what it really means to be an asylum seeker and how like draconian it is, like all the regulation that is put on them. And like, as I was doing research into it, into asylum seeking in the UK, I found out that asylum seekers have £37.75 a week to live on. This money is supposed to be spent on like all their living costs. So that's food, clothes, toiletries. During the application to become an asylum seeker, you can be detained at immigration removal center, awaiting the decision as to whether you can become, like, whether you're allowed to stay or not, which I found like really, I didn't know that before. So I feel like the movie really gives you a good insight into like the situation in which they have to live, especially with the couple first being at like a center before they are even allowed to have this house. And they're specifically told that you are not citizens. Like, this is like, this is not confirmed. So as long as you behave yourselves, then you will be able to stay, essentially. And you see how, like, essentially they're not even really treated as human beings in a sense. And they keep harping into them that they're so lucky to have this situation that they're in, and that their house is bigger than, like, the white man keeps saying, oh, your house is even bigger than mine, like it's so amazing, etc. So, and I was watching it thinking, like, even when he was like, oh, make sure you're one of the good ones, I was just a bit like, wow, like, this is really...
Yeah. There's so many microaggressions and like racial undertones and overtones, but like a lot of undertones throughout the entire film that we see. And like that was something I noticed too, was not just that they're not treated as citizens, but they tried so badly to be treated as citizens, especially the husband, right? Because what was the song? Peter Crouch at like when he was at the restaurant
when he went to the pub.
Yeah, like he was trying so hard. So it's like it also brings in this element of assimilation and having to get back into a community or society that doesn't necessarily welcome you. So it's definitely an interesting film. It has a lot going on in there.
It does.
So the other film that we took a look at was Bad Hair, and that is available on Hulu to watch. That's supposed to be a horror film about a main character. She's a young woman. She's working in the TV industry, and essentially she has to get a weave in order to progress. That's the message of the movie. She has to get a weave to progress. And then the other message is that the weave is evil. And it's like taking over bodies and things of that nature. So in my opinion about Bad Hair, if you want to watch it, I say go ahead. You might find some entertainment in it. But for me personally, as a Black woman, I found it incredibly insulting.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that my natural hair is not good enough. B, you have the
Yeah.
fact that this weave is this evil thing that takes
Mm-hmm.
over bodies and kills people. Like, you're trying to tell me that my hair isn't good, but you're also telling me that the hair I replaced my hair with is bad. So what is good hair?
There is no
Like,
leeway.
exactly. It's like a seesaw and it's very unbalanced. So I was not a fan. I was not a fan of this film. There's so many, in my opinion, so many different stereotypes and tropes that we continue to see over the course
Mm-hmm.
of time when it comes to horror films. And I don't know, what did you think about the film, Eunice? Because maybe people have like different perspectives, like other than me.
Yeah, I didn't get the chance to watch the film as it's not available here, but I did watch a few reviews. And the reviews I watched, they were quite positive. Like
Okay.
the first one I watched, the girl was talking about how she felt that the director did a good job in showing like the tension that Black women may have with their hair in terms of whether they need to relax it or like actually having to go get a weave, and the fact that
Mm-hmm.
we are somewhat forced to assimilate because we're told that our hair is unprofessional and that you can't really move up the ladder in that sense. So I got what she was saying, but in terms of what you said, and it's like a seesaw, you can't
Right.
win essentially. She
Yeah.
gets the weave and now she's evil, but before she couldn't excel because no one was looking at her credentials. They were only looking at
Right.
how she looked outwardly, which is like this is the unfair, like, I guess, position Black women are put in, because it's like
Yeah.
you have to make a livelihood. So I don't necessarily think that, because I watched another review where he was saying that Black women have to kind of like lose their identity in a sense to gain um, promotion in the
That's a
world
good
of
point.
work and things like that. But I don't necessarily think I would say it's a loss of identity. I think it's more so you're playing the game. If you know that this is the way the game is played, you
Yeah.
you start playing as well in order to be able to fit into these societies or fit into places in which you know that you're supposed to be in.
Right. So it's this idea of assimilation all over again. But for me, it's kind
Can
of
you hear me?
like,
Sorry. Yeah.
I can hear you. Yeah. I
Mm-hmm.
think for
Exactly.
me, I hear what he's saying. And I almost would consider it a loss of identity. Obviously, like right now, we're two Black women and we have two different styles going on, right? Like you're natural right now, and right now I have a wig on.
Yeah.
And we do have to we are forcibly subscribing to Eurocentric standards of beauty, which would say the straighter your hair, the more
Mm-hmm.
attractive you are, the more palatable you are. So I think if you're not someone, if you're doing something like the main character in this movie, which is she was changing herself on purpose to gain status and to gain respect, I do consider it a loss of identity. But if you're somebody
Mm-hmm.
who's like, yeah, this is where I grew up, this is what it
And
is,
yeah.
like I switch back and forth, I do all types of different stuff. I think that's a little bit different. I agree with you. I don't think it would be considered a loss of identity. And I think that in some movie critiques, we do have to be careful to make the distinctions between what is forced upon us and what we prefer to have happen. Um, I don't know. I just feel like the film was, I think it's late, is what I'll say. Because if we look maybe 4 or 5 years ago, before this reemergence
Yeah, I think it's
of
a bit late.
the, yeah, like if we look at the reemergence of like the Black is Beautiful movement, trying to have people wear their hair natural, get rid of the creamy crack, right?
Yeah.
Then that would be where that would have been the better time to do it. Like
Mm-hmm.
now we're already in this season of appreciating and loving our melanin and our natural selves. So I think it's late. But that brings me to my next point, which is if we look at the history of Blacks in horror versus Black horror. So
Yeah.
Blacks in horror would be, for example, like a movie, The Shining, or a scary movie where you have Black characters, but you don't necessarily, it wasn't written by a Black creative. And then
Yeah.
Black horror is written, produced, and then has Black characters and actors, right?
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, I haven't really seen too much of a difference between the two because in both, I feel like it's very stereotypical. If the Black person die first, we already know this stereotype, right? And then there's the content, whereas like I guess the difference for me, Blacks in horror, the content doesn't necessarily always revolve around like socio-political issues, whereas Black horror almost always revolves around some sort of socio-political issues for Black people.
Mm-hmm.
If we go take a look back through time, in 1915, Birth of a Nation, that's not considered a horror film, right? Like it's not in
Yeah.
the genre of horror. But in a way, for white people, I'm sure it was somewhat of a horror film because it's fantasy for them. They've never experienced anything like this. And then for Black people, it was horror in a different way that this is real.
Yeah.
And that alone brings me to my point that we kind of have to look at Black trauma films because it's been a constant narrative from since 1915 to the 1940s up until even now that our reality is scarier than their fiction, right?
Yeah.
So what do you think about that? Because that's something that's really been bugging me as I've been like reading through and trying to find some information.
I think it's very interesting, especially when you look at like how white horror films are, though I don't have like the most information on them. I know it's like based on these jump scares or like this
Yep.
fictional world in which they have to create fear, essentially. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
like Black movies, you don't have to create this fictional world of like monsters and zombies. You can just have like the real world, essentially, where
Yeah.
there's like, for example, in His House, people are asylum seekers and they're coming to the UK, or in Get Out, where he has a white girlfriend and he goes onto
Yep.
their house, where there are Black people who cater to the white family's needs. So I think it's very interesting that Black horror doesn't necessarily align with the horror aesthetics that white films do. We can
Right.
just kind of find horror in every day, which is kind of sad. Which is kind
It's
of sad, yeah.
when you say it, it sounds very Afro pessimist. I know we talked
Yeah,
about that before. It
we
sounds
did.
Afro pessimist versus Black horror. And
Mm-hmm.
for me, like one of the biggest things is that, like, if we look back at the films that we've had previously from the 1990s, that's really like a huge surge in Black horror films, which I wasn't even
Mm-hmm.
aware of until I started doing some research because it's it honestly never occurred to me that Black horror is even a genre of film,
Mm.
which again is sad because we should know that it exists.
Yeah,
Like we should know that we have fantasy and we have fiction that we can turn to. So some of the most famous films or most popular films from the 90s, at least in the US, would be the movie Candyman, Tales from the Hood, and Eve's Bayou. And the problem that some people had with Candyman was that he
yeah.
was a serial killer. And he was a
Mm-hmm.
serial killer killing other Black people in the same hood that he's from. And
Yeah,
they found that to be problematic because his character, he initially was chased and killed or burned. Something very tragic happened to him at the hands of white people. But instead of attacking white people, he was attacking himself again. So that's a problematic trope that we've seen over and over again, like the racial Black person or the Black person terrorizing another Black family. Tales from the Hood, we see rooted in poverty, and it's littered with socio-economic, socio-political issues throughout it. And it's like, when I consider a horror film, I don't necessarily want to think about my real life. My point is to escape, is to have entertainment. And I think the movie from the 90s that gets me the most upset is Eve's Bayou, because apparently this was a pretty popular film, but the movie is about a young Black woman who is possessed by a sex demon. Like, and not to change the topic of the conversation to misogynoir and colorism and all of these other isms that we have amongst the Black community that we need to identify. But the fact of over-sexualization of Black women, it's boring. And I wish I could say that it's been left in the past, but it hasn't. Because even in the film Bad Hair, here we are a decade or so later, and in Bad Hair, they have the main character go through misogynoir because the person that she was dating or dealing with decided to leave her for a light-skinned, straight-haired, flowing hair, pretty woman, right? And then on top of it, she was just seen as like a sex toy for him, and the landlord tried to rape her. So it's like, again, we see these overtones of over-sexualization still in Black horror films, not even just in the 1990s, but even here in 2020.
Yeah, I didn't know all of that happened in the movie.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I know.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so there's this one scene in particular where the landlord is asking her for her rent. He bumped up the price. So again, we're rooted in poverty. That's that trope again. So now we have the trope of desperation of the Black woman, because she's trying to figure out how to pay for her rent, how she's gonna get this guy off of her back. The landlord breaks into her apartment, and he she tells him, he like opens the door and walks in, but to me that's breaking in because he wasn't invited, right? So when he finally does come in, she's like coming out of the bathroom and she sees him. She was like, "Oh, Mr. So-and-so, like, I have your money right here." She turns around to grab her purse off the nightstand, and he's like, "Oh, you can forget about that. We can make another arrangement," in a very sexual way. Then he throws her on the bed and he attempts to rape her, but this is when her weave comes alive and kills him and sucks his blood with the tracks of the hair. And he's found dead outside, and the police just call it like a random murder type deal. But yeah, he tried to rape her, and then the Black man she was seeing, he left her for the light-skinned woman who was the boss, with the flowing hair, as she loves to say throughout the film. So yeah, it's just a lot of these continued stereotypical overtones and undertones that I'm seeing, and it's rather boring. And for me, even in Jordan Peele's movies, right? Like, let's look at Get Out. As you mentioned, we were talking about the white woman and the Black man. Can we stop this already? We know Black love exists by now. It's all over Instagram, it's all over Twitter. So I'm not quite sure, but in a sense, like, are we getting the representation we need, in your opinion?
I'm a bit conflicted because I feel that as Black people, we are hyper aware of like the way in which we exist in the world, which is why I think that the way in which some of our like art comes across, it's like we kind of analyze all the different systems of repression in which we face. So in a sense, I get why some of these movies are like socio-politically like charged, or like they have all the isms, because it's like these are things we experience and we want to like somewhat reflect the lives in which other people like us have experienced, and let other people know that, yeah, like I know what you're going through, or I hear you. But at the same time, movies and art in general is supposed to be a means of escape. And it's like, if you can't find that with movies, or in movies with people that look like you, it's like, where is respite for Black people?
Yeah. Where is our place? And you said something during a conversation that we had that really stuck out to me, and that was the idea of representation versus representation for representation's sake.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was so profound, especially in the moment that we were having the conversation, because yes, we've been fighting for representation, but I don't necessarily think this is it. Like, and I
Yeah.
hear you. Yeah, because the thing is, I hear you. These are our lived experiences. These are things
Mm-hmm.
that we should definitely pay attention to. But I feel like I err more on the side of entertainment. Like,
Yeah.
when can Black people have art for art's sake?
Mm-hmm.
Chucky, that movie about Chucky, that movie about the little white girl who had her period, Carrie, I think it's called. Like, those aren't necessarily socio-political things that are harming white people, because there are some things, some issues that I'm sure that they feel like are a problem for the white community or for the European community, French community, et cetera, et cetera. So why is it that our films for entertainment, our mass media in general for entertainment, always have to have a historical context?
Mm.
Always. Like, in racism, in Get Out, racism was the monster, right? You had this white woman who was a part of this white family who was looking to take over Black people and their bodies and minds.
Yeah.
Why couldn't we just have like some version of, like, I don't know, Chucky the Bride, but like Chucky the Bride noir? Like, we have, it's just a regular scary movie with regular
Yeah.
scary movie stuff that happens, but with Black people in it. Like
Mm-hmm.
Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I feel like that would just a regular movie.
Yeah.
So I don't quite get it. And it's interesting because her name is Tana Reeve Dew. She's a Black horror film professor. And she talks about representation as like it's a double-edged sword. Like, we're
Yeah.
being represented, but are we being represented correctly? And I thought that was an interesting thing for her to say, because I agree. But then again, I don't agree with her analysis of the movie, of Jordan Peele's Get Out, of Jordan Peele's Us. Like, because she finds those things to be profound, and she feels like we've made a huge shift and a big change, and we've come so far from
Mm-hmm.
1915. And I would argue otherwise. I would.
Maybe it's that he survives the movie. I think sometimes I think why she found that certain movies had progressed is that the Black person actually survives, and they're not necessarily painted as the villain. Or so,
Yeah.
like in Birth of a Nation, how the Black man is like he's essentially painted as this rapist villain that is here to like destroy white womanhood
Terrorize
and
and
like terrorize the white community. So
yeah.
I think it's that is that Black horror now gets to veer away from centering white people and just be not necessarily just be about Black people, but Black people are now the center. They're not these expendable characters that get killed just so that people can be scared and go, oh, you know. I think
Yeah.
it's just that we see people actually go through the movie and like they venture and they finally like his friend at the end comes and saves him.
Right.
And I think that was a like really big breath of fresh air for people in the cinema. I think that's the first movie I watched where people were so engaged and like were actually responding to the screen. Like usually when I go to the cinema, it's silent, but people were like proper engaged with like the film.
Yeah.
But I definitely do hear what you're saying. It's really hard. It is a double-edged sword. But then again, it's also the question of what is good representation. Because I feel like good representation is different.
And we would have to be
everyone.
the one to make that.
Yeah, we have to determine what that is.
And that's exactly the hard part, is having a collective opinion on what we consider positive representation of Black people throughout every genre of film, right? And I think that I hear what you're saying. I think we have more to our story than the lies that they told us in elementary school, right? Like we know that there were fighters and survivors, and our ancestors are great, powerful people.
Exactly.
So I do think it's important to have films where Black characters survive, which is, it sounds ridiculous to say because that should just be regular, right? We shouldn't even have to say that. But I don't know. When I first saw Get Out, like I think it came out 2 or 3 years ago. I was a huge fan. I was like, oh, I finally sitting here really considering it. I'm like, was that groundbreaking?
Yeah.
For me, I mean, and I know we're getting close to time, so I don't know if there's anything else you want us to touch on real quick. But I'll say that for me, I am not particularly impressed. There's a quote by Tana Reeve Dew, the same professor I was talking about earlier, and she says that I'm just really grateful we've reached a time where we can show more of our full measure of humanity on film. And I feel like that's a very misguided comment to make. And I say that because to say our full measure of humanity on film, first of all, the full measure of humanity of Black people is very, it's a large thing to encompass in itself. But to say that we've come to that place, I don't think we have yet. Until we can get rid of these stereotypes of the white savior. Even in his house, he was like crying and begging for them to change his location of place to live. And I understand that comes a part of with the whole asylum seeking thing, but it's again the same message of needing a white savior to come and save our poor Black A-words, you know what I mean? Like, can we get away from that? Can we get away from the concept of enslavement? Even in Lovecraft country, we see that set in segregation. Like, when can we just be 4 or 5 friends at a house on the lake and some random serial killer is coming after us, or some mass chainsaw wielding man is coming after us? Like, I just want regular Black stuff.
I think for me, I just want there to be like another or like an opposite. So in terms of, I don't really want there to, I don't want to rid the idea of like the Black movies we have already. I just want there to be an alternative that other people can watch in terms of, okay, so here are these like gang films, these or whatever, but here are also like 5 women sitting on a lake house, drinking cocktails, you know, doing their thing, and we see their friendship. Right. You know what I mean? Things like that. So I think for me personally, it's more about range and showing like the expansiveness of Black life, as you have said, because I think the issue I have with the idea of good representation is that I think it typically hinges on the idea that we only want ourselves to be portrayed positively. And I get why people want that, because historically we have been depicted as like just bad. But I think that people are nuanced. No one is totally good and no one is totally bad. So we
Right.
need stories that actually incorporate that nuance and show that, cool, there can be like a drug dealer, he does his thing, but maybe he like
So we got disconnected for a quick second, but we're back. And all I was saying is that I've seen in quite a bit of blog posts and Instagram posts that we need positive representation. And to go to your point, like I agree that we need reality, right? We don't just need positivity because nobody's perfect. And if we were, then we wouldn't have any of the issues and problems that we have today, right? So I just wanted to affirm that point. I think that's an amazing point. Did you have anything else that you wanted to share before we leave our viewers?
no.
Okay, so real quick, everyone, if you have some time, you enjoyed this podcast, let us know your thoughts.
Yeah,
Do you
definitely.
feel, right, like, do you feel that Black horror films have really progressed, have actually progressed in 2020? Are there still changes that we need to make? What can we do to be better? So let us know your comments below. We're definitely paying attention and we will see you next time.
Yeah, see you next time.
Bye.
Thank you for watching. Bye.